Hello and welcome to the Warhammer channel. Today we'll be examining the Gloomspite Gitz warband for Warcry and using math to come up with some effective troop choices for you. Before I get started, I'd like to apologize. In the Iron Jaws video, I had some incorrect data that I was calculating, and that's why the brute with jagged gore hacka came out to be a very good buy, so those points need to be increased. I must have just entered them in the spreadsheet wrong. So from now on, whenever I have a find that looks too good to be true or particularly juicy, I'm going to go back and double and triple check the data to make sure that that is indeed correct. So in this particular faction, I do have some very interesting findings, and I have double checked all of the raw data, and the findings that I found are indeed very interesting. So with that being said, let's move on and start talking about the Gloomspite Gitz. So in building your list, you're going to need one leader, so you can have one and only one leader. So I'm going to talk about the leaders first, and then once we're done talking about the leaders, I will talk about the troop choices. And once we're done talking about the troop choices, I will give you some thoughts on my overall favorite units or some ideas of what I think the most valuable units in this army are. And that's it. I'm not going to throw out an example list. I haven't actually put together my own list for this yet, and that's part of the reason I think is this is a very strange faction. There's going to be a lot of min-maxing in this faction. So there's things that move very fast, hit hard, die quickly. There's lots of different ways you can build it. So if I gave you one example list, it could be completely different from another idea of a list. So to spare you from constructing 15 different lists just in this video, I'll just talk about what I think the good troop buys are, and you can build your own lists from there. Okay, so you need to pick a boss, and we have the Grot boss, the Squig Hopper boss, and the regular little Moon Clan boss. So this is not like the new boss they released that's standing on the mushrooms. This is just the leader of a big unit of Grots. So okay, so in this faction, this is a good example of how things differ from Age of Sigmar on the tabletop versus Warcry. So in Age of Sigmar, the Grot boss, I think the Grots in general, the main difference is they do move a little bit slower than the Squig Hoppers. It's a random movement value, so who knows, but they generally hit a good bit harder than the Squig Hoppers. So Squig Hoppers are a bit more chaff. As we'll see as a theme in this Warcry warband, the Squig Hoppers surprisingly hit harder than the Grots. So not really sure why they made that choice, but that's how it plays out, and we'll see the data to support that. Because I've seen a lot of comments online about people going with Grots because they're stronger and hit harder, and that's just doesn't seem to be the case. Okay, so only 15 points difference between the Grot boss and the Squig Hopper boss, and we'll see this is not a big deal difference. That's why I think I'm going to slightly prefer the Squig Hopper boss, but there's explanations, and this is a very small gap to cross here to pick one versus the other. And they're very similar on the wounds. The toughness, though, is a little bit different, so a pretty tough, sturdy 5 toughness and 24 wounds in the Grot. Squig Hopper boss is a bit squishier. The 2 points of move, though, is very, very key. So every point of move in this game seems to be a whole nother tier of movement capability. So the fact that it's 2 whole inches more per activation, it means that this thing can just get across the field like nothing else. I haven't gone through every warband that's released yet, but of all the warbands that I've seen, I don't think anything beats this as far as its pure movement capability. So very, very fast move from the Squig Hopper boss. Still pretty good move from the Grot boss, but if all other things were equal, I think this is a problem when examining the difference between these two units. Those extra bit of move is going to be pretty important as this game unfolds. Okay, start scrolling over a little bit. Oh, and I should say I'm not really going to talk about the Moon Clan boss too much in discussing this the boss options. my overall thoughts on him, he's just a very average, mundane leader choice. So if you just didn't want to cough up all these extra points for one of the fast-moving Squig options, the Moon Clan boss is fine. He's probably worth the points. He's just okay. It doesn't stand out in any particular way. So the very boring boss option there. Okay. So the Boing Grot's a spear versus a sword on the Squig Hopper boss. Like I said, no big deal there yet. The 2-inch range could imply a particular tactic when using this boss. So I think both of these boss options are going to be very squishy. They're glass cannons, so to speak. So they hit reasonably hard and they move very fast, but they're just not going to be surviving long on the tabletop. So the fact that this thing has a 2-inch range means that you could pair this with other you could pair this with either Cave Squigs or Moon Clan Grots, and you could have your boss kind of sneaking or quickly zipping around the battlefield, engaging targets that are already engaged with your Grots and kind of supporting different combats and using hit-and-run tactics. Whereas the Squig Hopper boss, since he only has the 1-inch range, he's going to need to get right up there and be engaged in combat. So if you're within 1 inch, you're going to need to actually make it disengage activation to get out of that combat, whereas if you had the Boing Grot boss with a 2-inch range, you can make those hits without ever entering that 1-inch orbit. So just something to be aware of. I think that might help justify that extra 15 points. Alright, here's where things start getting weird. And this is going to be a general theme through Warcry. When you look at the damage statistics, you see 2 base damage on each and 5 crit versus 4 crit on the Boing Grot, and your initial thought is, okay, Boing Grot boss hits harder, he's doing more damage. But I think this attacks value in almost all cases, this is going to be the most important statistic you're going to want to look at when trying to figure out damage. And this seems to be one that people kind of ignore and get lulled in by the damage and crit values. But all of these values have to be multiplied in some fashion with the attacks value. So if you take the base damage and multiply it over here, crits always just hit on 6, so it's kind of a special case. But as you can see, the Squig Hopper boss having 5 attacks versus 4 is actually going to more than make up for this 1 extra point in critical damage that the Boing Grot boss has. And they are both Strength 5, which I thought would be a little bit odd. I kind of expected the Boing Grot boss to have Strength 5. I did not expect the Squig Hopper boss to have Strength 5. So these are pretty equivalent attacks across the board, and just more attacks being dished out by the Squig Hopper boss. So not only is he going to be dealing more damage on average, but there's going to be more opportunities for those criticals, so just more reliable, consistent damage from the Squig Hopper boss. And they have the same runes, so there's not like a special ability you're getting with the Boing Grot boss versus the Squig Hopper boss. They're equivalent in all aspects. Okay, scrolling over, just examine their points per wound, and so this is a very simple metric, just the number of wounds they have and the number of points, and you divide them. So you can see you're paying a pretty expensive tax for those fast-moving Squig mounts, and the Moon Clan boss is a decent value. Like I said, bosses in this game are generally a little bit expensive on points per wound across the board. You're just not going to see many great buys there, and I will tell you if there is a great buy. But Moon Clan boss, not terrible, not good, he's just there, so he's the baseline. And the Boing Grot and Squig Hopper boss are not great in terms of wounds. Reddit user Mitchin Impossible recommended I throw in this particular column here. So I didn't have this in the last video, but basically taking the values you see on the left here and points per wound and coming up with I've just called it warband index. So if 1.0 is the average of this warband for that value, this column represents where this particular value falls in relation to the rest of the warband. Now I've had to split this up in terms of bosses and troops. So this, for when we're dealing with bosses, I'm only going to be comparing it to the other bosses, because you can only take one boss and you have to take one. It's just a completely separate system of comparison. So you can see the Moon Clan boss is the cheapest value here, points per wound, and these other two are a bit more expensive. But that's pretty obvious. You only have 3 pieces of data there to work with. So, but points per wound, this is just talking about the number of wounds. That does not factor in the toughness value. So that's why I have this other metric where I have let's examine how that damage characteristic stands up against strength 3 attacks in this column, strength 4 attacks, and strength 5 attacks. So the way to read this would be, for example, if you had an attacker of strength 3 that did, let's say, a maximum of 12 damage per attack, it would take him an average of 4 attack activations to, on average, take this down. And that assumes a critical ratio of 2.0. So like if you the amount of damage he does on a critical versus the amount of damage he does on a regular attack being roughly twice. I think that's on the low end. So I'm being very conservative with these numbers. Some warbands do more. The low end warbands do around 2. So so this is a way that we can account for the toughness when figuring out how durable is a troop on the tabletop. So the Boing, Grot, and Squig Hopper, you can see against a weak attack, they're basically equivalent, and against strength 4, they start to pull away. This is really the biggest point of disparity. The Boing, Grot boss is much hardier than the Squig Hopper boss against strength 4. Unfortunately, strength 4 is going to be, I think, the most common. I've treated these all as roughly numerically equivalent, and when coming up with his wounds average, I will wait till kind of the end of the of all these warband card releases to kind of adjust these averages and see how many actual units are at what various strength, and maybe I'll come back and adjust these numbers. Okay, against strength 5 though, that lead isn't quite as pronounced, but it's still present. And we can see if you average all these 3 numbers, the Boing, Grot boss does stick around a little longer than the Squig Hopper boss by almost, what is that, 20-something percent, less than 25%, but still a decent amount. Maybe worth that extra 15 points if you do favor durability in your boss as opposed to damage output, and you don't mind paying the extra 15%. So points per average wound, like I said, the Squig Hopper boss is kind of a terrible buy in points per average wound. So you are not buying this with the assumption that you're getting good durability on the tabletop for your value. And the Boing, Grot boss turns out to be not terrible. That toughness 5 puts him in that category, I think. And the warband index for these, so we can see the really the only outlier is the Squig Hopper boss. He's pretty bad in compared to the other bosses, and the other 2 bosses are pretty similar. So pretty easy metric there. Let's move on to the damage. And like I said, this is the shocking thing, I think, to most people. You're going to assume that the Boing, Grot boss is going to be outputting more damage, but that's not the case, because the Squig Hopper boss does more attacks, and the difference in critical in the Boing, Grot boss does not make up for it. So against the toughness 3 opponent, the Boing, Grot boss is doing an average of 7.33 damage per attack, and the Squig Hopper is doing 8.33. And it's the same against the toughness 4. They both have strength 5, so these are going to this advantage is going to carry all the way to the toughness 5 opponents, and the Squig Hopper boss just deals consistently more damage across the board, so it has a higher average damage. And this average damage that the Squig Hopper boss is doing is pretty good in comparison to other warbands. It's to have anything in the 7 range is notable. Most warbands that have something in the 7 damage per attack range may only have 1 or 2 tops units in their arsenal in that range. So this is a good amount of damage to be doing. And like I said, the Moon Clan boss is probably the most boring unit that I've looked at so far, but 150 points, not bad. Points per average damage, this is just this column divided by the amount of points you're spending for it. The Boing, Grot boss obviously comes out a good bit worse than the Squig Hopper boss, because he's cheaper and doing more damage. And the Moon Clan boss is a nice value, but just a boring value here. I should note that I think from playing this game a little bit now, I wouldn't go strictly on the points per average damage and points per average wound metrics that I state. When you're constructing your list, I think it is important that you just bring some absolutes along. So something that does a good amount of damage. Like, you're going to need damage dealers even if they're not a good value, and you're going to need some tanks or some sources of wounds on the table even if they aren't good values. So try to bulk out your list with good buys, but you're still going to need something out there doing damage when you need it. And the Squig Hopper boss I like because he does good damage and he can get to where the combat is very quickly to do that damage. So I think he's my favorite option here. That being said, let's move to the troops. That's enough about bosses for now. I'm going to turn those on, and I'm going to hide the boss options. Okay, so we have 3 options for squigs. We have the Boing Grot, the Squig Hopper, and the Cave Squig. Let me actually let's run through these in 2 sections. I'll do the squigs first, and then I will do the grots, just to keep it, because I'm only going to compare those with each other for now. Okay. So the squigs are expensive. All the grot options are much cheaper. They, you see 220 and 200. These are generally expensive options. I would put them squarely in the elite category. This Cave Squig is in that between 100 and 150, but closer to the 150 option. This is kind of the semi-elite range for points. And not a lot of wounds for what you're paying for. So hopefully these things are going to do a lot of damage. Let's take a look. We have that same issue. Oh, and I should mention, the disparity between points between the regular and the bosses is even higher. So you're 20 points difference from the Boing Grot compared to the Squig Hopper, whereas the bosses was only 15 points in difference. So let's see if that's compounding that disparity here. 2 points, once again, the Squig Hopper, absolutely killing it in the movement department. Regular Boing Grot bounders are still nice, but they're just going to get lapped by their Squig Hopper cousins. Cave Squigs only move 4. You can bring along the Squig Prodder to help get them an extra movement. Let me just pop over to the abilities section here real quick, since I'm on the topic. Here is the ability that the Squig Prodder can use to give the Squig that extra move. So my concern with this is that this is a triple ability, and all it does is give it an extra bonus move, and that bonus move is only 4 inches. This is a kind of not a great triple. I don't know. Unfortunately, in looking at this warband, you see a lot of the interesting abilities that you're going to really like to use are all triples. So your abilities are expensive in comparison to what they do, I think, with this warband. So Cave Squig has a movement problem that doesn't have a cheap solution. It's also only toughness 4. The Squig Hoppers, the regular Squig Hoppers, are only toughness 4. And, okay. Once again, the 2-inch range on the Boing Grots versus the 1-inch range on the Squig Hoppers. And here we go again. The Boing Grots do fewer attacks than Squig Hopper, and in the boss option it was 4 versus 5. Now it's 3 versus 4. Even though it's still 1 difference, the fact that these are lower numbers means that percentage-wise that's a much bigger gap that's being created. So I think we're going to see the Squig Hopper here doing a good bit more damage than the Boing Grot Bounder. Even more of a difference than the bosses had. And everything's strength 5, which is pretty nice. You know, they do crunch when they hit. Okay. Same runes on the Boing Grots and the Squig Hoppers, so they're equivalent. Our average points per wound for the troops, like I said, I've broken these off. You can see I've made the bosses, I've taken the average of the bosses and the average of the troops because there's no real sense comparing those as equivalent. You can't take one instead of the other. You can only have one boss and as many troops as you want. So average amongst the troop is 8.875, and you see, since I'm only looking at the Squig options, these are all more expensive than that. So you're paying a lot of money for not a lot of wounds on the Squigs, and the Grot options are going to make up for that. So in comparison to the rest of the warband, both of these Squig Rider options are pretty bad. The Cave Squig is about average, so he's not crazy, but this isn't a great warband for durability in general. I would say this is, so the fact that he's average in a not great durability warband is saying that he's not great durability. So how many wounds versus strength 3? You can see pretty low values here. Okay, let's get over to talking about the points per average wound. I'm not going to walk through every one of those columns and talk about them in detail. Both the Boeing Grot Bounder and Squig Hopper are still pretty bad in points per average wound here. They've gotten a little worse as comparison to their boss variants, and the Squig Hopper is still a good bit worse than the Boeing Grot. And you can see it's I think the worst in the warband. And so yeah, this guy is just not going to hang around very long. And honestly, the Boeing Grot Bounder isn't going to either, but at least he's got a bit more durability for what you're paying. If you're wanting durability on the tabletop, just the Squigs aren't going to be. That's not their job from the data. All right, the average damage output. Let me scroll back over. Average damage output, and you can see, since everything is toughness 5, the two rider options here, they don't have any drop-offs or divergence in the ratio there. The Squig Hopper consistently across the board does more damage and is cheaper, therefore your price per average damage is going to be cheaper, and he's going to be about average with the points you're paying for the damage he outputs across the warband. So pretty close to 1, and the Boeing Grot Bounder is one of the worst options in the warband for what you're paying for his average damage. The Cave Squig is surprisingly good points per damage. So he does the same damage as the 200 point Squig Hopper, but he is only 140 points, so 60 points cheaper. But you got to ask yourself, is that extra 6 points per activation of movement worth that 60 points? And I think probably. So, all right, let's start looking at the rest of the troop choices here. I will leave up the Squig options just for your visual comparison. Okay, we have Stabbers with the Barbed Net. We have Shooters. We have Squig Herders. And the two variants of the basic Grots, the Stabbers and the Spears. So I will caveat by saying I don't have a great grasp of how effective ranged is in Warcry yet. So the numbers, if you just tabulate the math, don't look great, obviously, for ranged combat, in points per damage and all that. But ranged is, an interesting tactical advantage. So I'm not going to harp on the ranged combat values too much. Just be aware of your plans for your warband strategically, and if you want to bring ranged, you can bring it, but the numbers don't look great in a spreadsheet. But the battle isn't the spreadsheet, the battle is on the tabletop. Okay, so the Stabbers with the Net and the Squig Herders, you'll notice, are 45 points each. They're oddly cheap in comparison to the rest. The Shooters are 65, and our two Grot options are 70. And my hopes for this warband is that we would have a whole bunch of really cheap Grots we could spam the field with, kind of like how we do in Age of Sigmar, with relatively inexpensive blocks of 60 Grots, just creating really oppressive gaming environments. But this really isn't that. 70 is not turbo cheap. There's a lot of other cheap infantry out there that's even cheaper than that. and they're not particularly great for what you're spending. So just kind of average. So my dreams were a little bit dashed when I saw the data, but there are some good options here. I think the stabs with the barbed net are very nice, and there doesn't seem to be any restriction. In Sigmar, you can only bring, I forget whatever it is, 3 per 20, and in this game you could bring 1 leader and however many nets you could fit in your warband. You might not win any games, but there doesn't seem to be a restriction. Okay, so moving on, all of the basic grots are 8 wounds each, and this is something to be aware of, is that with only 8 wounds, regardless of the toughness, there's going to be quite a few things out there that are going to be able to just one-shot you off the table. So it could be frustrating if you rush into combat and you never actually, you spend 2 activations on 2 moves, and then your opponent just wipes you out before you ever even get to attack with that or use an ability with that troop. So just be aware that the odds of you taking multiple rounds of combat with any of these options isn't very likely. There's just not enough there. Okay, they're all move 4, and only the guys with the shields, so the stabbers and the spear versions, have toughness 4. And we'll see how that kind of moves the points per effective wound or points per average wound metrics. Okay. The stabbers with the poke and spears have range 2, and I will divert a little bit of time to talking about 2-inch weapons versus 1-inch weapons when we get to that column, and my thoughts on that. It's kind of a general wargaming issue, but it pops up here as well. Okay. So the stabbers have 1 extra attack than the spear versions. Even though the spear guys have 2-inch range, that's important. And the stabbers with the barbed nets, they do the same number of attacks as the stabbers, but their crit is half as good. So not as much damage on the critical, but they still have a pretty similar attacks and damage profile. Everything is strength 3, not real good. Like I said, the stabbers with the barbed net have this trapper ability. Let me hop over to the abilities tab, and this is basically you can roll a dice, and on a 3-up you can prevent a fighter from using a move or disengage action. So if you had multiple of these barbed net guys running around, you can really thwart the plans of your enemy. It is only a double ability, so it's something you can reliably pull off. You can basically always guarantee to have, you always get a wild dice, and you'll probably have at least 1 singleton on the board. It would be unlikely that you would just roll 2 triples, but it could happen. So you have a pretty reliable mechanism to use this ability. You can always turn one of your singles into a double, or you have a good chance of rolling a double in the dice phase. And so that's, in true Grot fashion, your goal is to annoy people. So he has that ability. The other Grots don't. So that's a point for his favor. The Squig Herder, I already mentioned it a little bit when talking about the cave squigs. It's a triple ability, and it's, it could help at the very beginning of the battle when you're nearby, or if you happen to catch the Squig Herder up to the cave squig that you rushed, he might get to use it again. But I don't think it's going to be a clutch play in your warband potentially. Okay. Price per wound, we see our squig options here are terrible, and all the regular Grot options are just mediocre. The 2 excellent buys here are the stabbers with the barbed net and the Squig Herder, and of these 2, obviously from a tactical perspective, I would prefer the barbed net version. How they relate to the rest of the warband is obviously the stabbers and the barbed net and the Squig Herders are way at the top. Everything else is kind of in the middle, and at the bottom of the barrel is our mounted squigs. Okay. Let's scroll over to points per average wound, and we can see here how much we're paying for the ultimate durability of the unit. The Shuda is particularly bad here in comparison to the rest of its Grot cousins, and the Netters and the Squig Herders are particularly good. And this is where I was hoping that the Stabas would be better than they are, at least in the yellow range for me, but they're sadly just not good buys for the number of wounds. Okay. Damage output, everything is strength 3, so you're not going to see big drop-offs here with the other toughness tiers. Let's look at the... Okay, so the most important thing here to talk about is choosing which of your Staba options to take. So you can take the Staba with the sword or the Staba with the spear. And so the Staba with the sword does almost twice the average damage than the one with the spear does. So obviously his points per average damage is going to be drastically lower, and he's a very good option in the warband for damage output. The spear is not only bad, it's abysmal. It's the same as the shooter option. So this guy with the bow shooting from 12 inches away is doing the same amount of damage as the spear is doing right up there in melee combat. So this is one of the worst melee damage outputs that I've tabulated so far in all the warbands. So the spear is a not a great option. Now you might be thinking, well, with a 2-inch weapon I can get more of them in combat, so it'll make up for the difference. I'm going to throw up a graphic here. The first graphic you're seeing is, so the red is an enemy, and this is going to be best case scenario for the spears. All the things in blue are 2 ranks of your grots attacking the enemy in red, and we can get 18 in the 2 ranks. So this would be 1-inch weapons. You can get 18 of them attacking the enemy in red. With 2-inch weapons, we can't double this number. We can add 1 extra ring around the outside here. So you see the ring in gray appear. This will be if we have grots with 2-inch weapons. So now that adds another 18 to the mix. So we have 36 grots attacking the one enemy here. Like I said, this is the configuration that is the most optimal for the spears. This is the absolute best case scenario for the spears. And in this case, if we have all the ones in blue, if those were all swords and they were attacking, they do, let me see, it is 50.94 average damage per attack from all those spears if you put them all together. So an average damage of 50.94 from the ones in blue. And if we add in the back row, so all the ones in gray, and imagine that they're spears, 18 spears do an average of 28.08 average damage per attack. So 18 spears do slightly more than half of the damage of the 18 stabas. So if all the things on the screen here were spears, they would be doing an average of 56.16 average damage per attack. But if we had a mix of the two, if we had a mix of stabas and spears, we could get an average of 79.02 average damage per attack. So the only way that the spears start to edge out stabas is in this complete encirclement scenario. So unless you're completely encircling, and you then having only spears could be okay, but in every other case, it would be better to have mostly stabas or just no spears at all. I would, like I said, this is a rare tactical case I probably have never seen in my life, so I would just run with stabas. You're going to get higher damage on average. In almost every other configuration you could arrange your grots, you're going to get more damage output from pure stabas than anything you can do with the spears. That being said, if you have some crazy strategy you've come up with to, kite enemies from 2 inches away and whatever, maybe spears are your thing. But with these numbers that we're seeing here in the spreadsheet, you would have to really justify yourself to me and why, or not to me, but to yourself on why you're using spears at all and not just going with shooters, because shooters are doing the same amount of damage. They're cheaper and they have much better range. Even if the shooters get into melee range, which is their least favorite form of doing combat, they're outperforming the spears. So everybody outperforms the spears. And we can see in the warband index column, the spears are the worst option in the entire warband for what you're paying points per average damage. And I think the cave squig is actually the best option, with the stabbers with the barbed net being slightly behind the cave squig and equal to the squig herder. But because of the better ability with the barbed net, I would prefer the stabber with the barbed net. So, all right, that about covers in detail all of our troop options. So what do I prefer? I'm just going to talk about most valuable players here. Let me expand the option here. So we have our bosses and our regular troops. For the bosses, I think my MVP award will go to the Squig Hopper boss, but I'll caveat and say it's not a clear-cut advantage over the Grot boss. I could see a list where the Grot boss has a strategy behind it to make it worth the extra points. But from a spreadsheet perspective, the Squig Hopper boss performs a little bit better, in my opinion, than the Grot boss. And the Moon Clan boss is fine if you are just boring and just like boring things. So he does free up more points, though, to put more Grots on the table. If that's your ultimate goal, is to have as many Grots as possible on the table, I would support that wholeheartedly, just for fun. You might not win many games, though. Just be aware. My MVP for the troops would be, no surprise, the stabber with the barbed net. He's not very durable, is not going to stay around very long, but he's got a cool ability that's going to annoy people, and he does good. He has a good price per wound and good price per average damage. He's a good cheap buy with a nice ability, which is kind of, I think, the spirit of Grots, is you want cheap dudes on the table that can annoy people, and he sums all that up. So next will be the Bone Splitters, and hopefully coming very soon, and hope you enjoyed it. Thank you.